acknowledge that it's great to be here, that we're here under the Lordship of Jesus and pursuing the kingdom of God together, and His Spirit is with us to help us, and so that's good. You, wherever you go in life, it really doesn't matter. If you've ever been a children and families minister, you remain one at heart, and so you need your visual aids. And so even on Zoom, I don't know if you can see this, but this is a seed pod, and this is really important in our discussion today. These pods, they're all dried up and crackly. This one's completely empty. Some people call these itchy bombs, and this one's still got some little seeds in it. This is so important to our discussion today because it connects us to the ways in which God has created life on the earth. And we need to put our investigation about faith formation in intergenerational community alongside the wisdom of all the ways that God has revealed His goodness to us around us. Now, often we construct other kind of ways of thinking about the world might work. We look beyond the wisdom of God, and we say, no, we really think the world should go like this. So here's my diagram of, ever onward, ever upward, and development has begun to be thought of in that way, that we should always keep increasing. Our bodies should keep getting stronger. Our minds should grow in strength, and knowledge get fuller and fuller and bigger. Our economies should continue to boom. All of this kind of thing is really strong in our culture. And to make that to break it down and go, well, how do you manage that sort of thing? We've then redirected it and said, well, probably it happens in stages like this. And so this is like, you've seen this 1,000 times in so many different kind of contexts. But it's actually not how the world works. You get to a stage, and then you get to a higher stage, and then you get to a higher stage. You climb ladders like that, and eventually you get to the top and there's nowhere to go. You can only come down. As we think about faith formation, intergenerational faith formation, so many people have carried that kind of stage theory across into faith formation and ignored the way that God's made the world and the way all life happens, and tried to fit our faith formation into this kind of stage thing and divide people up according to this is the age continuum, and this is the faith continuum. And so this idea that you should have more faith the older that you get. And just being around the traps, listening to people who have done some years on the clock. There are people outside of our churches who used to be people of faith, and the reason that they've logged off is because they didn't continue to grow like this. They felt their faith going backwards, and they thought, hang on, what's meant to happen? And then there's also just people who are disappointed in that they're still there, but they feel like I've plateaued, or how is life in God and faith formation actually vibrant for people? Well, going back to our good old seed pod here, this is part of a whole circle, a rhythm, a seasonal rhythm of growth, in which a seed falls into the ground and dies, as Jesus says in John 12, falls into the ground and dies, and then something grows. It grows small, it grows vibrant, it flourishes, it puts out branches, it puts out fruit. It comes to a fullness, and then, of course, more seeds to fall to the ground. There's a time of waiting, and it goes on. So, as in the natural world, faith formation is a whole lot more like this. It's a cyclical kind of process. And I'm sure if you reflect on your own spiritual journey, you will see that there have been times of real flourishing, and then times of fallow, or maybe wilderness, quietness, not necessarily distress. Death doesn't have to be It doesn't have to be violent, painful. It can be just a time of quiet. And then suddenly, you know, stirrings of the spirit are more vibrant, and you go into a period of flourishing, and you see God do something that you couldn't have imagined. And then that comes to a point of fulfillment. And then there's reflection and quiet that follows on. And this is really, really normal. And those people that I know that have been following Jesus for decades, in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and are not, you know, cranky old obstructive, you know, chairperson of church council kind of stereotype, but in fact, you know, the freshness of Jesus is evident in them all the time, still at that age, at 90. It's because they're still cycling through, not thinking I should be better than this now. So this approach to thinking about, well, how does faith formation happen? It happens in these seasons of quiet and flourishing and growing and fruiting, and then resting, Sabbathing, if you like. How does that help us in constructing good kind of practices of faith formation? And so one of the things that I've got for us to look at today is this paper on the rhythms of spiritual practice. So within the broad way of thinking about my life in God, there are these different seasons, but then also kind of on a micro level of how is God present in my life? How am I practicing my faith as a 4-year-old, as a 9-year-old, as a 16-year-old, as a 25-year-old, as a 40-year-old, and as a 50-year-old, and on into the future, as many days as God will give me? What does that look like? And one of the rhythms that we have become very attached to through the Christendom era is the weekly rhythm, that we gather once a week and we celebrate the goodness of God. We confess our sins. We listen for what God has to say to us through the Word, and we pray for the world. We care for those around us. There's a gathering. It's a weekly rhythm. And that's been really important to many people. And in Christendom, that was kind of institutionalized as well. Alongside that, we've had other rhythms in Christian history, but they've not been as dominant as that one weekly service. And as we go to think about, well, what does intergenerational faith formation look like? That weekly gathering has in some places turned into a place of competition and congestion too. Like, even as we've been adventurous and tried to, okay, well, let's give some things a go, it's then gone, well, we're trying to do a 25-minute sermon and have an interactive, prayer engagement with really genuine reflection and the opportunity for people to share in small groups and make intergenerational connections across with their life. And suddenly we've got a 3-hour service or, chaos. So again, this idea that we have a number of different rhythms of faith expression in our lives, of which the weekly gathering is one, is a really helpful exercise to do for all ages. So this is kind of like a project that you might kind of think about encouraging communities to do, which is to do some kind of diary work and to say, well, what do you do maybe just once a day that connects you with God? And it might be I get out of bed and say, thank you, God, for another day, just as simply that. Or it might be that you do your scripture union or Bible reading notes, or it might be simply that when you gather for your evening meal, you stop and give thanks to God together for the food that's on the table and think of those beyond who are in need. These simple points of faith expression that happen in the everyday. And people have different ones of those. So just getting people to document what happens on a daily level. And there's no, this is better than that. It's simply recognizing how God has found, recognizing that faith is a gift to all of us. The faith that you have, the faith that I have, the faith that a 90-year-old has, the faith that a 1-year-old has, all of that faith is a gift received from God. So any faith that I have, it's not mine. I didn't make it. It's simply gifted to me by the gracious hand of God, and that I've received. We hold ourselves open to that. So we let people say, what is it? Just what happens, and it might be that someone takes 3 deep breaths, at the start of each day and feels the Spirit of God just animating them. So helping people track that for themselves. Then saying, what do you do maybe a couple of times a week? So it might be that you meet with a prayer buddy for a prayer walk. That's one of my rhythms. Where someone just says, so Beth, how's it going for you? And or it might be, for a child, they might have a couple of sort of group things. They might go to Girls Brigade or Boys Brigade or a kids club or something, and have a couple of those things a week. So we track those. Then we track what we do once a week. And so the weekly gathering, what is that? Why do we gather once a week? And I always like to sort of press people a little bit about that not being the place that we come to be fed, but the place that we come to serve. So it's the place where we bring our gifts together. And yes, of course, we're nourished by it, because being in the midst of all of these people who have been gifted by the Spirit of God in such manifold and diverse ways is just awesome. We're truly a blessing to one another, and we can't go away empty if indeed we all bring our gifts to one another. But we don't come all sitting there like, a whole kind of tray of cups for pouring out. We come, full, and we tip all over each other in the great punch bowl of the fruity Spirit, if you can go with that metaphor. So what do we do once a week? Now, just a little sideline here. We've been part of an intergenerational group that's grown from 12 people to about 35 for the last 23 years. And in the midst of that, people have come to faith. People from outside the church, and some of them have come into the church, sort of started doing the regular Sunday thing, but not all of them have. Some, that's too, there's just all prickles and barbed wire for them in that, and it seriously disables their faith rather than nourishes their faith to turn up to something that happens in a church building at the moment, which is, it's terrible, but that's just the reality. But we still say to them, what do you do once a week that is your, God's gift to the world through you? So it might be that you take your kids and serve in the soup kitchen, on Friday night. That might be your once a week serving. The important thing about that is to recognise the faith that God is giving you in that experience, your children together, that God is giving you faith that He's at work, that serving those who are just at this particular point of need is a faithful, hopeful thing, because you know that one day you'll all sit around at a great feast together. So it's a faithful practice, not just, oh yeah, I ticked that off. And so then to encourage everyone to document their week by week, what do we do that we serve and use our gifts to bless one another. Then what do we do perhaps on a monthly basis? And that might be, there's a number of now intergenerational kind of small group house church communities that are doing, that get together just sort of monthly for something a bit more celebratory. So looking at how often do we need a really good big worshipy praise creative thing that's all the whistles and bells. Maybe trying to fill a roster for that every week is not, it's not practical, and it's not really fruitful use of our time. We kind of end up coming off sort of half-baked. But once a month we might gather for something really fruitful and celebratory and joyful. Or maybe once a month we gather together and we witness by, we go out into our local park space and do a prayer experience there. We do something that's external. There's a whole stack of things that are monthly rhythms for people. Some things like, the good old mothers' union, or men's fellowships, and in the old school stuff. They're monthly rhythms of just gathering together and saying, what can we do? That's an expression of the faith of God within us that holds us. And then what do we do seasonally? What are the things that come around? So Lent is a particular thing, for Anglicans, Catholics, and the odd Baptist is twigged these days. That Lent can be a season of, particular attention to journeying with God towards and through and to the other side of suffering in love. Or, we've just had Halloween, and I know that's controversial, but still some people would say, well, this is an opportunity just once a year. We focus on the people that we've, the saints that have gone before us. And, dead people aren't scary. They're examples to us of faithful life. And so we might have a ritual or a way of celebrating that sort of seasonally. And then what are the things that you do once a year? So it might be that you go on a camp, or you go on a beach mission, or you have a pilgrimage kind of thing, or once a year there's a particular event that like a theatre production in which you work hard and you produce something together that God is at work in. And so your faithful life and your experience of the faith of God at work in you and through you and around you isn't dependent just on one of these things, but actually is interwoven in all of these rhythms across life, and they are all affirmed. So instead of being really anxious about just what are we doing on Sunday, or what are we doing on Saturday, or what are we doing on Wednesday, that one thing that's important, when our gathering is, we're constantly asking each other, what are we doing every day? What are we doing once a week? What are we doing a couple of times a week? What are we doing once a month? What are we, what are our seasonal opportunities? And recognizing that the reality that for many of us across a lifespan, we will have, the seasons in these circles, these cycles. There'll be times when actually going to church to the gathering, the weekly gathering, is impossible for us because of illness or because of distance or whatever. But our faith doesn't fail there because we've got our other rhythms going on. And then also because it doesn't fail there, you can come back into the cycle of the weekly gathering. Or, we all have times when we think, oh gosh, is it really 4 weeks since I've had a quiet time, had personal time with God, a daily personal time. That happens to all of us, I think when my children were born, that it's not, I've failed because there are these other things around. And then we can slot back in and pick up the rhythm, and we recognise that fallow time is just God has been at work in that, preparing us, maybe clearing some ground, and then we re-engage. All of that then sets the tone and the resources for what does a faithful life look practically at any age, and to be able to ask, the 7-year-old, what can you do every day so that you remember God's faithfulness to you, or you practice God's faithfulness to you? And for our 7-year-olds to be able to articulate, well, every day when I run as fast as I can, like Eric Liddell, he says, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure, every time I run. And there'll be a 34-year-old, who says, yeah, when I pull on my middle-aged man in lycra and go for a run or go for a ride and ride really fast, and feel the joy of God in that as well. So we begin to be able to make these intergenerational connections, because we're not saying going for a run every day is a higher level of faith anything than having a quiet time, or knitting a patchwork rug for children in Africa, or preaching a sermon. Like, all of these are all within the one life of God. I think perhaps I better pause, and we'll that's probably my 25 minutes, and we've got questions emerging. So shall we at least pause there? And Julie, it certainly can, because one of the things about intergenerational faith formation is it does upset all the paradigms of power that have been institutionalized in for 1500 years of Christendom. And so we all feel like when power gets turned upside down, some of us get really excited about that, and some of us get really nervous, but we all feel something when our usual power structures are disrupted, and intergenerational faith absolutely does that. So we just, that's around it, both positively, yes, this is fantastic, and also, ooh, not too sure. So house churches can be very amenable because you've got a whole different capacity to structure things. You can genuinely give youngest to oldest a really good voice in that, and you don't necessarily have to follow liturgies or forms that perhaps aren't as productive. They can be perceived as being in competition. So churches that are running buildings and ministers and wanting to fund that kind of thing can feel threatened by a house church. I'm working with a church at the moment who want to explore intergenerational things, and they've asked me to come on their church camp to launch some discussions there, and then for those who are interested to keep meeting sort of fortnightly after the camp for kind of a series of 5 weeks to explore the tools and opportunities and discussions of intergenerational stuff. But there's already a little small group of families who have been thinking about could we plant a small, maybe a Sunday afternoon community, sort of not quite a house church, but as an alternative community. And most of them have stopped going to church, regular church at 10 o'clock on, years ago, a couple of years ago at least. And the church sort of thinking, well, is this a good way? Because they want to start meeting, they want to, they've been a small group, this might plant a little congregation, but do we really want them to plant an intergenerational congregation? Don't we actually want them to come back to 10 o'clock and have a Sunday school? And so there's kind of, and I've said to them, this process that we're embarking on here, I have to be honest with you, I think you're going to end up with these, this bunch of families actually planting a congregation. I think that's what God is doing here, and you can either resist it or you can celebrate it. I think those discussions have to be had, and for mainstream church to go, okay, we celebrate and recognise that this is a faithful expression, that people are nurtured in their faith here, people serve in their faith, are extended, and mission happens through house church intergenerational gatherings, but let's not kind of think of them as a church split, or let's not be sad about them not coming and filling our Sunday school or Sabbath school or whatever. We were hoping they would. Let's work out a partnership with that. And so the church then might make some I don't want to say compromises, but might make some adjustments and say, let's recognise that you might come once a month, or a couple of times a term, and we'll work with you on this to try and avoid the competition.
I think I would just reflect too on the house church still has to be very intentional about its intergenerationality. It just, in what I've seen in some of the simple church model stuff that happens, the kids are out in the backyard playing and the adults are in the lounge room talking and stuff. So I think it's when we think about what are the gifts that I bring that we can share with each other, rather than how can I best have somebody listen to me or best be fed. Yeah, that's a really important thing that we need to do intentionally in that kind of house church, more simple church model, or it just becomes a repeat of some of the terrible patterns we've got elsewhere.
The other thing is just thinking about this seasonality in the church. So empires, they do actually rise and fall, but they never like to admit it. You know, they always think we're going to go on forever, and that is actually their doom. And similarly, the system of church organisation that we have with property and denominations and ministers on full-time wages and blah 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 blah, that's not going to be forever. It's just not going to be forever. Though we're not done with it yet. That's the other thing. But even house churches are seasonal too, and I think there's a lot of grief. Some people feel like, oh, we planted this, you know, we had this house and it was really beautiful, and you know, we went for 3 years or 4 years, and then somehow it dissipated, or you know, this key family moved away, or children different age or whatever, and it finished, and there's great grief about that. I actually don't think that longevity is the only measure of the measure of God in something, that that it's okay for something like that to rise, to flourish, to be what God asks it to be in that time. And then, you know, lives do move on. We're called to different places, communities shift, and the way in which God wants to minister in that community needs to be allowed to move as well as the community shifts. And so there are actually some very difficult situations where people have held on in a, you know, to a particular form of meeting and even trying to serve the community when the community around them has shifted demographics. So I think when we encourage people to, you know, if they want to form a house church, you know, say, first of all, don't cut your links with all your other Christian, you know, being part of a denomination or being part of a mainstream church. Stay connected, because we need all of those interconnections. That's part of the, you know, overlapping rhythms over time, but also overlapping enmeshed networks. That's what we're doing here, being, you know, Churches of Christ and Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists and, you know, Girls Brigade here. These interlinking things are important. So keep those things, and also keep an eye for where you are in the season, and it can be time to finish, and that's okay. Do that well.
Darren, do you want to bring out your question?
I'm an old-fashioned girl, and I still think that the truth wins out. I love the truth. And when you speak to some of our really fabulous older saints, and you say, tell me about your journey with Jesus across the years. Tell me how God has been faithful to you. They don't tell me a story of this, or, you know, of this. They tell me a story of this. And so I would really encourage people to tell their stories, to, you know, find a way of doing that. I mean, that's just a very powerful thing for any community to do. But particularly where you have respected elders in the church who will give witness to this idea that, yeah, I didn't actually, I might have gone through a system that looked like these stages. So, you know, like there are older people who actually did Sunday school exams and that sort of thing. You know. Goodness me.
I'm not that old, but yeah.
Well, that's right. It had diligent, you know, that particular system. But when they say about what was God actually doing in your life, they will talk about, you know, the seasons of suffering, the seasons of almost losing their faith, of God, you know, reinvigorating, turning up for them as if for the first time. So, and and their voices can be very powerful and very convincing, and it is actually the truth of what life is like. You don't want them to present their CV, because that's just a, you know, that's a fallacy, but what has the journey been? So that as an exercise is really important.
Mm.
Firstly, we just have to attend to the scriptures, and you know, like one of the absolute foundation statements of both the Old Testament and the New is that, you know, Jesus reaffirms this as well, that we're called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength. You know, it's the whole. And even the most dour, straight-laced, I'm going to preach my sermon, it's going to be very exegetical and dry. You say, okay, well, let's just do that, but let's not have any hymns. It's like, oh no, we have to sing. What, you know, and there might be, they have to be good words, but nevertheless, we could just recite the words of the hymns. You know, no, we actually have to sing. So these other holistic parts of our faith, even for the most heady, intellectual, inclined, they actually know that there's more to it. So we need to call those things out, and we need to say, you know, that's great, that's really strong, but these other parts of who we are, you know, why are we having cups of tea? Why are we having, you know, why is there a morning tea roster and a flower roster, for goodness sake? You know, forget that, you know, surely it's just the word. No, these are important parts. So even within our most traditional tapestries, there are all of these different threads, all of these different colours. And so it's a matter of saying, starting, oh gosh, this is an old educational maxim, isn't it? Start with the known and proceed to the unknown. This is what we already know. This is how this has been formed. And so what does that now look like? We're not actually moving outside what you know already. Nurtures and grows faith. I found the Streams of Living Water, 6 Spiritual Traditions of Richard Foster and the Renovare movement a really fantastic thing to do with clergy, because it recognises the different traditions. Some of them are linked to denominations, but actually they cross denominations. And so I know around this table today, some of us have been in the same denomination all our lives, but that's reasonably rare. And even if we have been, most of us who are in Christian ministry and service have cross-pollinated through networks like this, or, you know, other evangelical or, you know, social justice organisations, where we've rubbed shoulders with other traditions and realised that our passion for the gospel, our passion to love and serve the world, is actually shared by people who practice their faith in really different ways. So that particular resource, there's a workbook. You kind of plot yourself around these different traditions, and you recognise that all of our traditions, all of our ways, contemplative, evangelical, charismatic, social justice, the holiness tradition, and I've forgotten one. I always forget this one because it's me. Incarnational, the incarnational tradition. All of these are embedded in the life of Christ, and the fullest expression of them is in Christ, and that we actually need to help each other with all of them. So it's a very practical, doable resource. It's great to do with clergy. It often really refreshes their faith and allows them to see that, because there's academic writings in all of these different traditions. You know, academic rigour doesn't belong to the word-centred tradition, the evangelicals. You know, everyone's got it. So it enables them to feel like, yes, this is serious, and but access that. And it's just, we did it in our intergenerational small group several years ago, and it was really transformative, just even on a everybody tradition. Yeah,
that's great.
on where churches have crashed and burned, just even trying to keep functioning. So some churches have become reasonably small, and they're still trying to do the full roster of, you know, Bible reading band, kids talk, Sunday school, for various ages, youth group, seniors, like, you know, they're patterning themselves on, you know, like a mega church model really, but they've, you know, got reasonably small resources, and it just keeps falling over, and people are cranky because we can't get people to fill the rosters, and who will lead the children? Nobody wants to do that, but nobody wants intergenerational either. So, you know, it's seen as a compromise. So I've actually got sort of 5 models of alternative responses that churches that have got to the falling over bit have tried. And so there are lots of options. They're not all intergenerational, but once you kind of disrupt we can't keep going as we were, what should we do? It does actually create some opportunities for that. But also, one of the transforming things about intergenerational faith formation is to not see, well, here we've got our little oligarchy, our little group of people who are functional, contributing, can do stuff and keep the ship running. And then here's all the needy people, of which the children are always considered, you know, what will we do for the children? They're never considered as contributors in that model. That's one of the big transforming things of intergenerational faith formation, is to say, here is all of us are gifted with the grace of God, with serving. We all are image bearers. We're all sinful. So we're all as much of a liability to each other, but also as much of a gift to each other. And so then to say, how are children, young people, the very oldest, how are they a resource for the life that we'll have together, and not just going, well, we've got these kind of leadership, because that's one of the features of this model, is that when you get to about here, you should really be stepping up to some leadership, shouldn't you? But not before, you know. So it redistributes who's available for what can happen. That passage about unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, I mean, of course we understand that Christologically as talking about the life of Jesus and him, you know, dying for, you know, all of us, and the new creation that is gifted out of his death. But it's also, you know, in John's Gospel, and it's a bunch of Jewish people going, you know, unless a seed falls into the ground, all of our Jewish practices that were so important to us, some of those have, you know, been crucified with Christ, and we've had to let them go. And, you know, for the new expression of faith that is the gift of Christ. There was, you know, that was a huge issue in the first century of having to let some things die, and it didn't happen easily at all. Yeah.
Well, you know, I just, as we come to an end, I really appreciate your time, Beth, and the joy of just getting together with like-minded people to share thoughts, and to, you know, remind us that we've got to keep on working on the journey, but we brought it to a level that is really practical and really helpful and really thought-provoking. And yeah, I just think it's really valuable. So thanks so much for your willingness to lead us in that way.
Well, I'd just like to encourage you, like, all of that is not, you know, here's how to do a Bible reading, or here's how to do the sermon, or here's, you know, it's not that stuff. But I think that foundational work of how we are together, how we hear each other's story of faith, that's kind of, it's work that we need to do before we go, you know, particularly fiddling around with this, you know, now we're going to have services like this or services like that. It's kind of the deeper work of the life of God, which is important. And then those other things, I think, will grow naturally out of that work. Yeah.